Okay. Hello, everybody. And hi, everybody here, and hi, everybody at home, and wherever you may be. And it's good to have you all here. We've been having about 50 people or so attending us in person live, and we're up to about 150 people following us on the web. And so hello to everybody, and welcome. And I would remind everyone here that handouts from the previous weeks will be available at the front table where you're signing in to come, and as well as the current week. And for those of you who are watching online, you can always download the PDFs, which are on our website. Every week we'll update them in time for the study, so you can follow along and print them out at home. Or if you're part of the Zion congregation, we'll have them here on Sundays as well. But it's good to have everyone here. And if there's parts of the study that you think, what on earth did he say about that? You can always check it out on your handout, or if you wanted to see something that happened live, these videos are available for replay at any point throughout the course of the week. But welcome. It's good to have everyone here. We're going to have an opportunity this week as well for people who are watching online to ask questions. And Melissa, our web mistress, is going to be checking our YouTube feed. Is it the YouTube feed? And if you have a question, if you're watching this on our live stream, you can type in a question, and Emma will, Emma, what's your name again? Melissa will direct it. I just looked at Emma. Melissa, you're not going to do anything for us at all, and thanks for nothing, Emma, actually. But Melissa will call out the question, and we'll be able to hopefully address it then. And if you have a question at any point during the study, and I'm not thinking enough to say, are there any questions, feel free to indicate so by just waving your hand, and I'll say, great, what's the question? So, I think with no further ado, before we begin, are there any questions that arose as a result of last week? Good. That means it was just perfectly done. And so we're going to really start this week with the question, because we looked at how these Gospels were transmitted and how they came to be. But today we're going to address a little more closely. We're going to zoom in a little bit more on this and ask the bigger question, who is Mark? Because, why don't we have the Gospel of Bob? Who is Mark? When we read the Gospel stories, that's not a name that appears. And so why would the church value a document that comes from this otherwise anonymous person who's not himself one of the apostles or the disciples or the close followers of Jesus? And so we really need to ask that question, who on earth is the person who transmitted these words to us? And his name is actually not just Mark, but John Mark. Most of the people in the New Testament ended up having at least two names. John is the Hebrew name, his Hebrew name, and Mark, or Marcos, would have been his Roman or his Latin or even his Greek name, because they were living within a culture where the Aramaic or Hebrew language that the Jews spoke amongst themselves was not the language that the surrounding culture spoke. And so it's kind of the same way that in my neighborhood, for instance, there's quite a new influx of immigrants from overseas, and many who have a very different language background themselves will take upon themselves an English name to supplement their own name, whether it's Chinese or Indian or Bangladeshi or something. They will often take an English or an anglicized name that's easier for folks to pronounce, just like the name Rollwagen. And so my English name is Reverend Doug, because that's what everybody here insisted on calling me, because Rollwagen was just not doable. So we had Mark. His name is not only Mark, but John Mark. And he was the son of, believe it or not, yet another Mary in the Bible. How many Marys are there in the Bible? There's 7 distinct different Marys that we know of. It was obviously a very, very popular name. Some of you here may have been, how many were teachers here before? Yeah, and every once in a while a popular name comes up, and so suddenly you have 12 Emmas in the class or something like this all of a sudden. And it's the same way in New Testament times. Mary, or Miriam, was a name that was very commonly given to girls. The most famous Miriam would have been Moses' sister way back when, so she was a very important biblical character after whom many girls were named. So this is not Mary, mother of Jesus. This is not Mary Magdalene. This is not Mary, wife of Clopas. This is a different Mary. And John Mark was the son of this Mary, in whose home some believers met to pray for Peter's release from prison. Peter had been in trouble numerous times with the authorities for continuing to share the gospel. And one of those events is found in Mark chapter 12, one of my absolute favorite stories in the entire New Testament is found in Acts chapter 12. And we'll talk about that at a later point in our series. But Peter is arrested, he's put in prison, there's an earthquake, and as a result his cell door is open, and Peter is able to be guided out of the prison by an angel. And then it says in Acts chapter 12, when this had dawned on him, because Peter didn't really realize what was going on, when this had dawned on him, Peter went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Now, in those days, there weren't purpose-built churches like Zion, because Christianity was still against the law. And so they weren't able to build a building and call it a church where Christians met. Instead, they met in various homes, often the homes of wealthy women, because we know it's the women who have all the money, right? Particularly after hubby kicks the bucket. And so many of the churches met in those situations, just like this one here. Oh, he got better, Rhoda. He got better. And so they were meeting in the church house of the house which had become a gathering place for the Christians, the church house of St. Mark. Now, what's interesting is, if you go to the old city of Jerusalem today, the old city of Jerusalem is split into 4 quarters. There's the Christian quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the Armenian quarter. The Armenians had been in Jerusalem since about 300 AD. And in that particular quarter is a house church, still a very small church called the Church of St. Mark. And it's home to one of Jerusalem's smallest and oldest Christian communities, the Syriac Orthodox Church. And the Syriac Orthodox Church speaks the ancient language of Syriac, which is very close to the language that Jesus and the apostles spoke as well. And the Syriac Church is located inside the Armenian quarter, although it's probably older than the Armenian quarter was established. And it claims to be built over the home of St. Mark, the composer of one of the Gospels, the Mark that we're talking about here. And the church itself is built of local stone. It's lower than street level because over the centuries, the streets have been built up, and conquerors come and they smash everything down and they rebuild the city. And so in many places in Jerusalem, what was street level for Jesus is about 20 feet below what is street level today. And so it's the same with this Church of St. Mark. The interior is decorated with Byzantine-style Christian icons, which means icons from about the 5th and the 14th centuries, and all kinds of Syriac inscriptions, so writings on the wall in Syriac. And one of those inscriptions, which is dated to the 6th century, so to the 500s, presents the oldest claim that the church is built over Mark's home. So somebody in the 500s said, the reason that this place is here is because we're standing on the remains of the home of St. Mark. And there's a crypt beneath the church. When we think of crypt, we think of, coffins and haunted houses, but crypt can also mean a storage room, a lower storage room. And that area of the crypt is believed to be the house of Mark's mother. So if you're walking through the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, which is a beautiful quarter, you'll see that beautiful gold-colored Jerusalem stone out of which much of the city is built. And steps are leading down, and there's a doorway there, which is easy to pass by because the writing on the top of the doorway is in ancient Syriac, which is not one of my languages. And you go inside, and it's a very sparse-looking place. It's not very big. You can see it is well lit. There are icons on the wall and so on. Very typical Orthodox-looking place, but not rolling in decorations or in cash. But what's interesting is if you go downstairs, you go down into this crypt area, and you can see the more ancient stone walls, not at the back behind that little altarpiece, but on either side of that rough-hewn stone. And that's, as I say, between 15 and 20 feet below street level. And the Syriac Orthodox claim that this is the house of the mother of John Mark, where Peter and the early Christians met to pray. Is it actually? Well, the Syriac Orthodox say that it is. And if you go there and make a stink and say it's not, they'll gently escort you out and lock the door behind you. And if you say it is, then they'll happily show you very generously through the place. So this is a place, real person, real house, with some historical antecedents as well. Any questions about this kind of a thing so far? We're going to be next week we're going to be looking at the house of Peter, which is very archaeologically well attested in Capernaum, and I'll show you what remains of that as well. And so, John Mark, whose mother's name was Mary, and John Mark and Mary were in this house where the Christians met to meet and pray. Now, the Syriac Orthodox also say that this is also the location of the Last Supper. But most Christians point to a different site called the Edicule, which would be about 250 meters away from this on Mount Zion. So John Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas in their apostolic journeys when they were going from place to place. Barnabas was one of the earlier travel companions of Paul as they were sharing the gospel from city to city throughout the area of what is now Turkey. And Paul would later go into Greece as well. But they traveled together. We read in Acts chapter 12, when Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. So again, we learn from this that in Jerusalem is where John Mark is found. That's where he's from. And we hear that in Acts 13, when they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogues. John was with them as their helper. And this John is the same John Mark. So he's traveling with them. He's their helper. He's their assistant. What did he do? I don't know. He carried the bags. He, ran some errands. Maybe took some notes. Kept things together for the busy Paul and Barnabas. However, it didn't always go smoothly. We read in Acts chapter 15 that there was a dispute about Mark that was so sharp that it caused a separation between the Apostle Paul and Barnabas. Now, the Apostle Paul could be a pretty prickly guy. Some might even describe him as pig-headed and disagreeable. But we don't know if Paul had a wife, so it would be difficult to say if anybody else would describe him in that way. But he was a pretty prickly guy, and Barnabas was so agreeable that he was called the son of encouragement. That's what the name Barnabas means. He was an encourager. He healed wounds. He brought people together. So you really have to make an effort to get into a disagreement with Barnabas, but they did. And here's what it says. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company, and Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. So that's pretty unfortunate. What was the disagreement? Why did Mark desert them? We don't know. The great biblical scholar William Barclay comes up with this very complicated theory. He said that Mark probably missed his mother and went home. Whether or not that was why, or whether there was a theological dispute between them, or whether Mark was afraid because Paul and Barnabas were in some pretty dicey situations, and Paul had been imprisoned numerous times and so on. Is that why? We don't know. But it was enough that Paul said, we can't trust this guy. We can't rely on him. So there's no way we're taking him on another missionary journey. And there's Barnabas saying, well, let's just give him another chance. Let's give him a chance. No, we're not taking this guy. And so, again, such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. And that's really the last we hear about them. Yes? Was Mark around during the time of Jesus' ministry? Was Mark alive during Jesus' ministry? And I think it was Gary who asked that question last week, and I said, just wait till this week, and you'll find out. And so was Mark, well, just wait till a little closer near the end, and I will let that particular cat out of the bag. I don't want to just let all my good material out right off the bat. He would have been a young man, for sure, during the final years of Jesus, like a teenager, because he's quite young when he starts in with Paul and Barnabas as well. But the story doesn't end there. Mark was reconciled to Paul. We don't have a lot of the details of how that reconciliation came about. I probably think Barnabas had something to do with it. But once again, we find Paul employing Mark's assistance, recommending him and giving him what is called an honorable testimony. We read in the letter to the church at Colossae, to the Colossians. And Paul's in jail at this time. He's nearing the end of his ministry life. And he writes, "My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas." Well, now we know a little bit why Barnabas was attached to Mark. Mark was his cousin. They were not only companions in traveling, but they were related. But look, that Mark is with the gang. Paul says, Mark sends you greetings, Mark the cousin of Barnabas. And then Paul sends this message as well. You have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Now, why would Paul say that? Because earlier on, Paul had said, yeah, this Mark guy, if he comes around, send him away, because he abandoned us when we were there. But now Paul is saying, look, you've received instructions about Mark. Put aside the disagreements that I've told you about. If he comes to you, welcome him. Okay, so the bygones are now bygones, and Paul is moving on. In fact, in the letter called Philemon, Paul writes, "Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends you greetings, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke." There's Luke, writer of the Gospel of Luke. And he describes them as my fellow workers. And that's, for Paul, that's the highest praise you can give somebody, is to call them a fellow worker. And Mark is on that list together with Aristarchus and Demas and Luke. Mark continues to grow in importance to the Apostle Paul, and he was with Paul at the end. At the very end of his life, in his final letter, Paul asked Timothy, who's kind of his protege, to bring Mark to Rome. Paul's now in prison in Rome, so that he could assist Paul there in prison. He writes, "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry." So that's pretty high praise. Sort of like Rolvaga on his deathbed, saying, "Please, send for Will Henbest. He is very helpful to me in my ministry." And Will would say, "Quite frankly, I'm too busy, but no thanks." So there's that big reconciliation to the degree that as Paul's dying, who does he want by his side? Mark, the same guy that he refused to travel with. It's an amazing story. It'd make a good novel if any of you have skills in that regard. Any questions about the relationship between Paul and Mark, or the Mark story up to this point? Well, one question would be, okay, that's Paul. Didn't we hear last week that this is kind of the gospel from Peter's point of view? Where does Peter come into this? Well, right here. Around the same time, Peter said that there was one who was called Mark who was with him in Babylon. That's Peter's code word for Rome. They always called it Babylon. And Peter actually refers to Mark as his son, not his physical son, because remember, he's a cousin of Barnabas, no relation to Peter at all. But Mark is Peter's spiritual child through conversion. Maybe the day will come when you prove yourself to be such a fine candidate for ministry and so invaluable to me that I'll refer to you as my son. It's unlikely. It's unlikely. But we'll see. Melissa has achieved daughter status, but I don't know if you can achieve son, so we'll see. But Peter writes, by the way, for those of you watching at home, Will Henbest, our student minister, I'd ask him to stand and wave, but that would be pointless. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13 says, "She who is in Babylon," or in Rome, "chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark." And so there's Mark now with Peter. Paul ended up in Rome, and when he writes, he says, "I'm in Rome, only Luke is with me, please get Mark." And now Peter's in Rome, and who is he talking about? Mark. Mark is proving to be a valuable person to Peter as well. But, well, how many Marks are there? Was this Mark the same Mark that helped Paul? Well, most scholars assume him to be the same Mark because there's no historical evidence that indicates there was any other Mark of note in the days of the early church. Now, Mark was a pretty common name in the Roman Empire. Marcus was, as common a name as, maybe not quite as common as John, or let's say Douglas, as common as Douglas. People don't have trouble when I say my name is Douglas. They don't go, ha, ha, ha. How about we call you Rollwagen? And so Mark is a reasonably common name. But in church history, there's not another Mark who's talked about within the context of the life of the church other than our Mark here, John Mark, who's talked about quite frequently. So is it possible that Peter's talking about a different guy? It's possible, but in terms of the early church records, this is the one Mark we've got. And he's probably the same, almost certainly the same Mark, actually. So the majority of biblical commentators agree that the writer of the Gospel of Mark is in fact this guy, John, whose surname was Mark, who mainly worked with Paul, was also with Peter, and heard Peter's preaching in Rome, and interpreted Peter's words, and wrote a gospel primarily based on Peter's testimony. So this is the guy. He's got missionary experience with Paul. He's got quite a bit of experience in hearing about the gospel through the Apostle Paul and that work, and through cousin Barnabas, and through the early church that was meeting in his mother's home. And if, in fact, the Syriac Orthodox people are correct, and that church, that spot, is where the Last Supper was held as well, he would have been in the background while Jesus and the apostles and the other part of the crowd were having the Last Supper together as well. But that gets a little bit hazy at that point. But that's the guy. Now, any questions that leap up from you at this point?
Can you tell us now how old Mark would be at the end?
So the question is, how old was Mark at the end of Paul's life? The end of Paul's life and the end of Peter's life come around the same time, so you're looking at the time of the mid-60s, or a little bit earlier, 63 A.D., something like that. Mark would have, because we know how long Mark lived, I won't let the cat out of the bag and tell you that until the end of Mark's story as to when he died and what he was doing when he died. But because of that, because we know the age of his death and when he died, we can extrapolate that he would have been around 15 years old in 30 A.D. So at the time he's helping out Paul and Peter, he's probably about 45. So no longer a young man. Okay. Might even, be a little bit younger than that, or let's call it 4 years either way. Any other questions about that? Melissa, anything from our online? Nothing. So, we get a lot of our best information from a guy named Papias. And I say Papias again because whenever we're talking about the early history of the writing of the documents in the New Testament, our primary source is this guy named Papias. We talked about him a bit last week. He lived from about 60 A.D. to about 130 A.D. And he was a disciple of John. So this guy is really in the inner circle of that post-Jesus generation. And he said that John made this comment about Peter's relationship to Mark's gospel. So here's Papias, who had a lot of first-hand testimony from those late second generation or first generation Christians like John. And he said, the elder said this also. The elder is John. So here's what John said, according to Papias, about the formation of Mark's gospel. Mark, who became Peter's interpreter. What does interpreter mean? Well, Peter was preaching in Rome. Peter would have spoken Aramaic, which is the language that can be considered similar to Hebrew, which Jesus and the disciples would have been talking when they're, buying fish at the market. Hebrew was the language that you used in the synagogue. Aramaic was the language that you used with others. And they all would have spoken Greek, because Greek was sort of like English is today. Wherever you go anywhere in the world, you try out English, and that's your best chance of finding a common speaker. But now when Peter is in Rome, preaching to the early Christians who are Romans, they're speaking Latin. And so Mark is interpreting Peter's Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek words into Latin for the audience to understand. And so Mark, who became Peter's interpreter, wrote accurately, though not in order, all that he remembered of the things said or done by the Lord. So all of Peter's recollections of things said or done by the Lord was recorded by Mark. And Papias is very strong on this point, as he got this right from John, one of the fellow apostles himself. And we read about that in Eusebius' book, Ecclesiastical History, which was written in the early 300s. We'll talk about Eusebius in a moment. Now, Irenaeus is another early church witness. He's writing around 180 A.D., and he said, Matthew published a gospel while Peter and Paul were preaching and founding the church at Rome. And after their departure, which could mean their death, Mark, the disciple and again interpreter of Peter, also gave forth to us in writing the things that were preached by Peter. So there's a second witness of somebody saying, yeah, this Mark guy, he took down what Peter was saying. And this gospel is part of the recollections of Peter. This also indicates, if you notice, that Matthew publishes a gospel that Peter and Paul were preaching, and that Mark wrote the things down that Peter said. Then from Clement of Alexandria, another passage preserved to us by Eusebius, and this would have been written around 200 A.D., Clement said, the gospel according to Mark came about in this way. When Peter had publicly proclaimed the word and by the Spirit preached the gospel at Rome, those who were present, being many, urged Mark, as one of Peter's longtime followers who remembered what was said, to make a record of what had been spoken. And he did this and distributed the gospel among those who had asked him. And here's a very interesting line. And when this matter came to Peter's attention, he neither strongly forbid it nor urged it on. Now that's interesting, because this would indicate that Peter was alive, still alive, when Mark was circulating completed copies of the gospel, which means that this gospel was floating around in the early 60s A.D. And interestingly, when this matter came to Peter's attention, he neither strongly forbid it nor urged it on. Hey, Peter, this Mark guy, he's written down everything you said. And he's committed it to paper, and he's sending it out all over the world. What do you think about that? And according to Clement, Peter says, yeah, whatever. He neither strongly forbid it nor urged it on. Now, why would he forbid it? Because it doesn't have that that authority of Peter's own presence right there. Right? Remember that the early church was built upon the personal testimony of the apostles, speaking personally. And here is this now document going around with Peter's word. Hey, Peter, rather than you actually speaking, your words are being circulated around. Yeah, whatever. Now, let's say somebody said to me, hey, Rolvag, there's this Emma, and she's been taking notes of things that you've said and has put them in a book, and she's passing it around to everybody. Now, you know what I would say? Let me see that book. I want to make sure that that book represents accurately. It's not like, oh, Emma's taken 20 of your sermons that you hand out at the beginning of a service, stapled them together, and is selling them at a profit. I would say, well, good for her. If she can get anything out of that. But this is Emma's writing of my words. I might be a little bit anxious about that. But Peter said, no, that's fine. That's good. I can trust what Mark is putting down. We actually have another testimony here, and that's from this guy, Eusebius, who we continue to talk about. Who is Eusebius? Well, he's kind of the father of church history. And he created extensive accounts of the first 3 centuries, the first 300 years of Christianity. If you wanted to find out what was going on in 80 AD or 120 AD or 180 AD or 240 AD or 310 AD, Eusebius is your guy. He preserved a wealth of early documentation that would otherwise have been lost. One of the interesting things about Eusebius is that the times had changed already by Eusebius, that he wanted to see things that were written down. Don't tell me something, show it to me in writing, said Eusebius. Whereas Papias is saying, don't show me something written, tell me about it firsthand. I want to hear it firsthand. So the culture had already changed so that stuff that was written down became important. And Eusebius recognized that importance and saved this stuff, okay, and recorded it for us. And his exhaustive research and painstaking concern for identifying original sources were virtually unprecedented among ancient historians. He was the finest historian, not only of the church, but of any form at that time because of his reliability upon actual documented evidence. So without the work of Eusebius, our knowledge of the earliest days of Christianity would be extremely limited, including that of the persecution of the church in the reign of Constantine. And Mary Fairchild has been a very helpful scholar of Eusebius's work. Now, what does he say about the Gospel of Mark? He says this. He says that Peter's hearers were so penetrated by his preaching that they gave Mark, as being a follower of Peter, no rest until he consented to write his gospel as a memorial of Peter's oral teaching. He goes on to say, the apostle Peter, when he knew by the revelation of the Spirit what had been done, he was delighted with the zeal of these men and sanctioned the reading of the writing, that is, of the Gospel of Mark, in the churches. So that's very interesting. There's Peter saying not only, like we heard back here, that Clement of Alexandria said he neither strongly forbid it nor urged it on, but Eusebius says, well, you know what? I have documentation here that says that Peter sanctioned the reading of the writing in the churches. So as far as Peter was concerned, what Mark wrote was an accurate reflection of Peter's own teaching. And you just can't get better evidence than that. It always stuns me when, I'm watching some program on TV or reading an article in a newspaper or a magazine and say, oh, there's no evidence whatsoever that, the documents, the Gospels were written by people who had any knowledge of Jesus at all. I'll say, yes, that's right, there's no evidence, except for, this guy and 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 this guy, all of whom are doing it. But one of the most important aspects of why we should be able to trust the Gospel of Mark as an accurate reflection of the life and teaching of Jesus as remembered by Peter is that it was circulating around in the communities in which Peter had been ministering and preaching. And so the Gospel of Mark got its start not by being put on Amazon and somebody somewhere buys a copy of it who had never heard Peter and goes, well, I guess that's what Peter said. I don't really know Peter. I mean, no. The Gospel of Mark was being copied around by those people who had heard Peter firsthand and Peter's recollections firsthand. And they said, yeah, this is the stuff. I remember when Peter told us this exact story. And that's where it was copied, and that's where it became, if you were popular or well-known or well-attributed, and from there sent around. So that somebody comes from Rome, and they go to Antioch, and the people in Antioch say, what do you got? And he says, I've got this Gospel of Mark, which is really, Mark was Peter's interpreter. You might know Mark because he was a cousin of Barnabas, who's from Antioch. Oh, yeah, Mark. Well, he wrote these stories of Peter down, and we knew Peter. I mean, we lived in Rome when Peter was there, and we heard these things, and Mark made a record of the things that Peter said. And we've looked at it, and it's absolutely dead on. Actually, Peter said, yeah, this can be my representation in the churches. And so here's a copy for you guys. They'd say, okay, well, let's make a bunch of our own copies and hand it around to our people. And so that's how these Gospels were distributed and became those things which were the accurate representations of the life of Jesus. It was an organic process which led to a very, very reliable reflection of the teaching of Jesus. And so we can say, as pretty clearly as possible, that the Gospel of Mark then is really the Gospel of Peter as collected and transcribed by his secretary Mark. Now, I think it's kind of interesting that the church didn't call this the Gospel of Peter. They called it the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel according to Mark, kata Markos. The Gospel according, why did they call it the Gospel according to Mark? Because they were trying to be, and in fact they were, very accurate regarding where this thing came from. It came from Mark, from John Mark, who was known to the Christian community as the follower and disciple of Peter, as well as the traveling companion of Paul. So Mark had pedigree sufficient to give the gospel credibility. Yeah, were the writings of Eusebius preserved? One of the reasons why the writings of Eusebius were preserved in more copies than we have of the original copies of these is because Eusebius was doing a lot of his writing during the time of the Emperor Constantine. The Emperor Constantine, in the early 300s, declared Christianity to be no longer illegal. He declared it to be a tolerated religion. He did not, as is commonly misunderstood, declare Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. Theodosius did that about 65 years later. But Constantine said, this is not illegal. And he promoted church unity through calling church councils together, like the famous Council of Nicaea in the 320s. Nicaea is just on the other side of the Bosphorus from Istanbul. And had all of the major church leaders coming together to make sure that the church agreed on what it was teaching and preaching, because there were some pretty wild ideas going around that needed to be put aside. And so Eusebius knew Constantine, had met him at the Council of Nicaea and in other accounts, was very impressed with Constantine and wrote a very favorable biography of Constantine. So Constantine said, oh, I like this guy. Make sure there's lots of copies of his writings because he speaks very favorably of him, And so as a result, there's a lot of copies of Eusebius that get around and become very well preserved. And so we have some pretty extensive documentation of Eusebius's writings. He not only wrote this big one on church history, not only this biography of Constantine, he also wrote a really helpful kind of atlas of prominent biblical places throughout the Holy Land, where he had gone and visited and said, oh, this is where Cana was, and this is where Nazareth was, and this is where Capernaum was. And that became very helpful, is still helpful today to archaeologists who are continuing to dig and locate these places to this very day. So Eusebius was a good guy. For those of you who've traveled with me to Israel, or those of you who've been there on your own, if you've been to Caesarea Maritima, the port city of Caesarea on the coast of Israel, Eusebius was bishop there. So that was his seat. That's why we have these copies of Eusebius. Any other questions from that? Yes, Melissa. What about Papias? We know Papias through Eusebius's transmission of Papias's stuff, through his letters and writings and so on, which Eusebius gets the documentation, and he quotes Papias in his church history writings. What's interesting about Eusebius's quotations of Papias is Eusebius didn't like Papias. He thought Papias was a bit stupid. And the reason he thought this was because Papias said, I don't believe anything that's written down. I want to hear it from the horse's mouth. And so I've made it my life goal to talk to as many of the elderly Christians and elderly church leaders as possible. And he, in fact, became a disciple of the elder John himself because he wanted firsthand knowledge of stuff. And so for him, oral testimony was far superior to written testimony. And Eusebius says, well, that's because he was simple-minded. Why? Because Eusebius far preferred written testimony, because all those old guys were dead. So written testimony is what you had. And so Eusebius refers to Papias, one of our great sources of the writings of the gospel, as a simpleton. Any other questions? Very good. So let's look at the timeline here. Here it is in summary, and you might say, well, why didn't you just say this at the beginning and let us go home? Peter, 20 years after the resurrection, mid-50s AD, eventually ended up in Rome, where he spread the faith as a missionary to the Gentiles. Eventually, he acquired an administrative assistant whom he knew from the old days in Jerusalem, a young man named John Mark, whose mother's house had been the site of one of the early churches. Mark had worked with Paul until a falling out between them, and after assisting his uncle Barnabas, he settled in Rome with Peter and becomes to the old fisherman like a son. He also becomes an amanuensis, a personal secretary, recording Peter's personal thoughts and recollections and stories, which are eventually organized into what we know as the Gospel of Mark. Additionally, if the ancient sources are correct, Peter both approved of and perhaps even reviewed the gospel itself, which should more accurately be entitled The Gospel of Peter as written by Mark. So that's the whole summary. We eventually got there after talking with our friends Papias and Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria and Eusebius. So it shouldn't surprise us that Peter appears on every page, because it's Peter who's telling the story as he saw it, as he was there. It's a story of Jesus from Peter's point of view. And what's amazing is just about nothing happens in the Gospel of Mark without Peter being right there. But, and here we go, Mark himself may actually make a brief appearance. There's a double entendre there. During the arrest of Jesus in Gethsemane, Mark records the following. One young man following behind was clothed only in a long linen shirt. When the mob tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and ran away naked. Many believe this odd inclusion to be a personal note from Mark himself, that Mark was with the disciples, with the apostles in that cave hidden in Gethsemane, the olive press. The Gethsemane is olive press. And that they were hiding there from the authorities when Jesus was finally arrested as a result of Judas giving the hiding place away. And the soldiers were beginning to arrest the other followers as well, including Mark. And Mark had been in the cave in his nightie, his long linen shirt, his sidun is the name of the garment that he was wearing. So underneath your rough canvas, or not canvas, burlap kind of heavy wool robe, you had this softer undergarment that you would sleep in, and it was called a sindun, which you might think of as a nightie. And as he was running away, somebody grabbed him, and he tore out of that and then ran away naked. And if it was daylight, I would show you the stained glass window we have of the naked Mark running away. No, we don't have a stained glass window of the naked Mark running away. I don't know if there are any. Oh, Melissa says, yes. Do I lean towards the fact that this young man is Mark who's running away? No, I like it. It's who knows. This is why I say may, and it does fit the aspect of Mark being a very young guy who's hanging around and runs away naked. So that might be an appearance. Questions so far about this? Yeah, Lyle.
What you said tonight, Alan, gives Mark a much more intelligent man than we might have believed before.
Well, Lyle's point was that this makes Mark look a lot smarter than he would have looked before. Well, in the respect that he was obviously well educated, he knew numerous languages, he was indispensable to both the Apostle Paul and to Peter, and so he turned out to be a very prominent figure in church history, and ends up as, well, I'll leave that a little bit. I'm not going to tell you the end of the story quite yet, otherwise I'll just go home. Now, we're fairly certain that Mark wrote this gospel in Rome for Gentile, which means non-Jewish, and specifically Roman Christians. And why do we think that? Well, because he wrote to a Gentile audience, he explained Jewish customs, he translated several Aramaic expressions into Greek, he used several Latin terms, he reckoned time according to the Roman way, and at the climax of his gospel recorded the faith of a Roman centurion of all people who was standing by the cross in the time of Jesus' death. And I've included a bunch of the examples for you. For instance, in Mark chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, he's talking about the Pharisees complaining to Jesus that the disciples weren't going through ritual hand-washing ceremonies. He says, and then Mark explains, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing according to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and kettles. Now, if Mark was writing for a Jewish audience, he wouldn't have to explain this. This is really basic stuff. Another point, he says, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, well, every Jew in the world would have known this. Or, again, it was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. Again, every Jew in the world would have known these things. It's only to a non-Jewish audience that you would point this out. It's just, otherwise, it's like saying to somebody in our culture today, well, it's Christmas time, and at Christmas time, we sing special songs and put up a tree. Now, if somebody says that to you, you'd go, yeah, I know that. Right? But if you're talking to somebody who's just moved from another country, and you can say, hey, Christmas time is coming. This is when we do these things. Oh. He also translates Aramaic into Greek. Again, anybody from Judea would have known Aramaic, but not a Roman audience. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. That's an Aramaic term. Or when he heals Jairus' daughter, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha koum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Again, you don't have to translate that if you know Aramaic. Or in 7, if you say that anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, devoted to God, any Jew would have known what korban meant. He looked up to heaven, this is Jesus, looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. They brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. What is place of the skull in Latin? Anybody know? Calvary. Calvary means the place of the skull. That's the Latin word for Golgotha. At 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. This is probably the one that you're most familiar with. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's Aramaic. But Mark translated it for his non-Aramaic speaking audience, his Roman. He also uses Latin terms. When Jesus asked the demon, "What's your name?" "My name is Legion," which is a Latin military term for "we are many." When Jesus asks for a coin, he says, "Bring me a denarius." He doesn't say, "Bring me a shekel." He says, "Bring me a denarius." The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. Well, again, another Latin term that the group there would have known. But I find this really interesting. He told time according to the Roman way. In 648, seeing them distressed in... I'm using the American Standard Version because the other translations already put it into our modern context, but this is what's actually here. Seeing they're on the storm on the Sea of Galilee, seeing them distressed in rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. About the 4th watch of the night, he cometh unto them walking on the sea, and would have passed by them. The 4th watch of the night. That's a Roman military way of telling time. The reason that the NIV says, as it was approaching dawn, which we don't understand what 4th watch of the night is. This is very interesting. "Watch therefore," says Jesus, "for ye know not when the Lord of the house cometh, whether at even or at midnight, or at cock crowing, or in the morning." Cock crowing. What's the cock crow? When does that happen? Sunrise, right? Or, as you might say, morning. But that's not what this says. This says at even, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or in the morning. At 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a Roman signal that it's 3 o'clock and all's well, and that was blown on a special trumpet, and that sounding of the trumpet at 3 o'clock in the morning was called the cockcrow. The cockcrow. That's not dawn. Dawn is morning. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. And so when Jesus says to Peter, "Before you hear the cockcrow, you're going to deny me 3 times." What Peter hears is not, sorry, it's my best. Peter doesn't hear cock-a-doodle-doo. Peter hears, the Roman signal that it's the middle of the night and all's well. Yes? Who would care that it's 3 in the morning? Yeah, that's true. 3 o'clock in the morning seems to be the time when I always have one eye open looking at the clock. I don't know why. Maybe I'm waiting for the cockcrow. I might have Latin blood. So this is language that a Roman audience would know, right? And it's a good clue that Mark is writing to that particular audience. And also, he recorded the faith of a Roman centurion. When the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Who's the first person to really recognize the crucified Jesus as the Son of God? A Roman centurion, right? So of course he's going to be highlighted in the gospel that's written to appeal to the church in Rome. Any points about that or questions? Just a grunt of interested approval? I'll take that. So Mark uses the life and the works of Jesus to present Christ as the dynamic model of Christian life and service, especially in the face of intense opposition. When Mark is writing the gospel in Rome, things are not going well for the Christians. Nero is on the throne, and Nero is really beginning to turn the screws to the Christians and use them as scapegoats for blaming everything, all the problems of the world on them. You know, I have a friend down in the States, and a few years ago, I asked him, how are things going? And he says, well, according to President Trump, everything that goes wrong here is the fault of the Mexicans. He said, but where we live, we live in upper New York State, and there's not a Mexican anywhere around us at all, so I'm not sure who to blame. Well, Nero didn't blame the Mexicans. Nero blamed the Christians, because they are an easy group to point at. They had no political power or religious power of their own. And so there's intense opposition. At the time this gospel was written, late 50s, early 60s, the Christians at Rome were living under the reign of Nero, 54 to 68 AD, the first and probably severest persecutor of the church. And many of these Christians would die for their faith. So when we hear about Christians being thrown to the lions or Christians in the arena, it's during this time of Nero that this started. One of Nero's favorite tricks was not only to crucify Christians, but to crucify them and then at nighttime to set them on fire to light the way for everybody else. And he even lit some of his garden parties with Christians in this way. And so imagine how you would feel as a Christian in this kind of environment. Now what happens is the gospel would have greatly encouraged the Roman believers because they would have seen in Mark's narrative how Jesus persevered in the face of constant opposition. If you were here for a sermon a few weeks ago, you would have seen that the Pharisees and the followers of Herod begin plotting to kill Jesus in chapter 2 of the book of Mark. It's not a gradual buildup of hatred. It's an instantaneous, let's kill this guy, get rid of him. Because that's what the Christians there were feeling themselves. They were very much looking for Jesus as a source of inspiration to be able to carry on in the face of great persecution. Chapter 13 in Mark really contains the only long speech by Jesus in Mark's gospel. In Mark, Jesus is far more a doer than a sayer. He does a lot more than he speaks. In the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks a lot more than he does things. Chapter 13, though, is a whole chapter of Jesus' warning of the desperate troubles soon to come. And Christians living through these terrors, the Nero persecution, the rebellion, the Roman invasion, the destruction of the temple, they would have cherished Mark as a great comfort in those days. And finally, it's 16 chapters long. It's the shortest of all the Gospels. Mark begins abruptly. There's no birth narrative. It ends even more abruptly with the terrified women fleeing the empty tomb. It's also short, only 16 chapters, half the length of the other Gospels. And the Gospel can easily be read in 20 minutes or so. But that's no coincidence. The brevity, the shortness of it, and the 16 chapters are not coincidental. They could have been recorded and copied in what's called a threefold codex, an inexpensive and easily carried and concealed document. So, what I have here, this is a visual prop, I hope you appreciate the work that's gone into this, is a scroll. This is how books were written back then. You wrote them on a scroll. Most scrolls were a little bit smaller than this, but my eyes aren't very good. So I've got the large print scroll, okay? And this is what a book was, a scroll. You carried it around. But the Gospel of Mark was probably written on a codex. A codex was a new form of technology, a new form of writing a book, which soon became very popular. And there's very good evidence that it was the Christians who made the codex popular. So here's your scroll, your large print senior citizen scroll, unrolled, okay? And you can imagine writing on this, top to bottom, and then you flip it over, and maybe you write on the other side. A lot of scrolls are written only on one side. But this is what the Christians did. They took the piece of parchment paper, or papyrus, and they folded it, and then they folded it again. I was never very good at craft time in school. I was probably the only kid I know who actually got spanked as a result of craft time in school. It's a true story. You call that art? And now, if I had a scissor, but I forgot, this is why I got spanked. Yeah. The other kids would laugh too. So, and we'll go like this. This is also why they don't let me in the library. And now, I have a book, and this book has 16 pages. And not coincidentally, the Gospel of Mark is written in 16 chapters, which are small enough that they would fit on 16 pages of a codex. Now, why is a codex handy? A scroll is three-dimensional. Roman soldier comes, says, "What do you got there?" "Nothing." No. What's that? No, what? Hey, show me. It's a scroll. Oh, let me take a look at that. But if it's a codex, what's that? You see how portable a codex is? Goes in your pocket, easily copied, cheap to do, cheap to carry, folds up nice and small. It's a codex. This is actually a form of technology quite revolutionary around the time of Mark. And as I say, most scholars say the modern book, which is a codex, a book is just codexes with these 16 pages things stacked together and sewn together on the end, that the modern book as we know it is largely promulgated or is an invention or was made popular by the early church and the letters and the Gospels that were circulated and put together in a codex form like this. Hopefully they did a neater job, but I think that looks rather authentic as an ancient, brand new document. Dissatisfied early scribes often appended longer endings to the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark ends rather abruptly with women running from the tomb and they were afraid and over. But the earliest manuscripts don't include those longer endings. Most Bibles include, if there is a longer ending to the Gospel of Mark, it'll be a footnote in your Bible. But Mark ends and begins very, very abruptly. There's a good reason for this. One reason might be ran out of room. Another reason might be the Gospel of Mark starts the way it ends. And we're going to see what that is next week when finally we get to see what Mark wrote in chapter 1. Any questions before we depart? How old? Probably between the book itself or Mark himself. How old was Mark? Mark would have been between 45 and 50 when he wrote the book. So still, by my standards, a young man. The books would have been, the Gospel of Mark would have already been in circulation by the 60s. And it's very possible, and many scholars would point to a lot of stuff in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, which appears to have been taken from Mark, with Mark, the Gospel of Mark, sitting in front of them as one of their primary sources. Luke makes no bones about this right off the bat. He says, I've got the best sources right in front of me and eyewitness accounts as I write my Gospel. And so it's very possible that Luke had the Gospel, it's in fact quite likely, that Luke had the Gospel of Mark in front of him as he was writing, and perhaps Matthew as well. Any other questions? Well then, next week, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. We look forward to seeing you then, and God bless you all. And, Melissa's got one more, and it says, oh yes. Why is Mark associated with the winged lion? We're going to be addressing that in chapter 3. One of the symbols for Mark, thank you, Carla, good to see you. One of the symbols for Mark is a lion, and if it was the daytime, I would point to our stained glass window at the back, and the Gospels are symbolized by 4 creatures, one of which is a man, one of which is a lion, one of which is an angel, and one of which is an ox. And we'll find out about why the Gospels have those symbols attached to them when we're looking at Mark chapter 3. So Carla's just going to have to wait. Thank you very much. Run for your life before Carla asks another question. Let's close with a prayer, though, before we do. Let's close with a prayer. Dear God, we give you thanks that over all these centuries, you have made it so that these documents have been preserved for us and that we can learn of the life of Jesus Christ through the eyes of his faithful servants. Help us to cherish your word and to cherish the scriptures as the source of not only hearing your word, but of meeting Jesus. And for this we give you thanks in Christ our Lord. Amen. God bless you all. We'll see you next time. Mask up as you leave. Mask up.